Welcome to everybody. I am Lorena Neal. I am the legal literacy librarian at the Evanston Public Library, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody who is joining us from all around the world. This is our roundtable discussion of U.S. foreign policy under the Biden administration. And as you know, today is also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States. It's our only national holiday that is explicitly designed to be celebrated through service to others. And so today, as we look at the challenges faced by the incoming administration, we wonder how we can be of service not only to our fellow citizens of the United States, but to our fellow citizens of the world. Dr. King's last campaign was his campaign for poor people. And this campaign is as relevant now as it has ever been. We are in the midst of a still uncontrolled and unfolding pandemic that has disproportionately affected poor Black and Brown communities, and which has led to an economic depression that the United Nations Development Program projects could force 207 million more people across the globe into extreme poverty. The economic crisis is also being borne primarily by Black and Brown communities, both here in the US and around the world. By the end of 2020 in the United States, 1 in 5 adults with children reported that at times they didn't have enough to eat, while 1 in 5 renters were behind on their payments and faced the threat of eviction during the winter months of this still rampant virus. At the same time, the wealth of America's 651 billionaires increased by more than $1 trillion to a total of about $4 trillion. In addition, our nation faces a reckoning with white supremacy and with our racist history. This summer saw a series of police shootings and killings, again disproportionately impacting our Black and Brown communities, and police brutality in response to the resulting protests. This brutality was in stark contrast to the immediate response to the primarily white participants of the attempted insurgency on Capitol Hill on January 6th. All of these challenges are on full display to the world and cannot help but influence how the world sees us and how we are able to build new policies and new relationships under the Biden administration. And I know that we are all looking forward to hearing more from our speakers today on all of these issues. Danny Postel, the Assistant Director of Northwestern University's Center for International and Area Studies, will be moderating the roundtable discussion today. If you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat at any time that they occur to you. And I will be keeping track of those and we'll share them with our speakers during our question and answer session. So now I would like to turn things over to Danny so that he may introduce you to our speakers today and get the discussion started.
Lorena, thank you so much. I want to thank Lorena Neal personally and also the Evanston Public Library for its continued partnership on this series of forums on which we've been partnering for quite some time that engage with critical questions of global concern and address very intentionally address a public audience that brings the Northwestern community and the broader Evanston and Chicago communities together, and now in the age of Zoom, an even wider audience that otherwise would not have been able to participate in person. And thank you also, Lorena, for contextualizing today's discussion by marking the occasion on which it's happening. This is the second year in a row now when we've held a forum on the occasion of the Martin Luther King national holiday, and I appreciate the particular notes that you sounded in that connection. So I want to thank again the Evanston Public Library and also 3 other co-sponsoring bodies for today's discussion. The Program of African Studies at Northwestern, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program at Northwestern, and the Middle East and North African Studies Program at Northwestern. I think it's particularly significant given the contours of the discussion we're about to have that those 3 research programs have lent their partnership to this afternoon's discussion. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and I'll do so in alphabetical order. Mariano Aguirre was born in Argentina and exiled to Europe in the 1970s, where he has been living since. An associate fellow in the International Security Program at the London-based think tank Chatham House. His career has really had just an extraordinary, has been an extraordinary journey. Prior to joining Chatham House, he was senior advisor on peacebuilding at the Office of the Resident Coordinator of the United Nations in Colombia between 2017 and 2019. Before that, he was director of the Norwegian Centre for Conflict Resolution, NOREF. He was program officer on peace and security with the Ford Foundation. He was director of the Peace Research Center in Madrid, and he was deputy director of the Transnational Institute, the TNI, in Amsterdam. I first came into contact with Mariano through his writings for the magazine Open Democracy, where he's a frequent contributor and where I was an editor in the mid-2000s, and have benefited enormously from his contributions there and elsewhere. And I'm thrilled to have him as part of this discussion today. He is joining us from his home in Oslo. Next in alphabetical order is Zachariah Mampilly, who is the Austin Marxe Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs at the City University of New York, CUNY. He is the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, and the co-author of Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change. He's also the co-editor of Rebel Governance in Civil War and the two-volume Peacemaking, From Practice to Theory. We have Sarah Leah Whitson. Sarah Leah Whitson is the executive director of the organization Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN. Previously, she served as executive director of the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch from 2004 to 2020, where she oversaw the work of that division in 19 countries. She has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region, focusing on issues of armed conflict, legal reform, migrant workers, and human rights. And last but not least, we have Suiseng Zhao, otherwise known as Sam. I should say I've known Sam for some years because we were colleagues together at the University of Denver, so it's a particular pleasure to have him with us today. Sam is professor and also director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He's also editor of the Journal of Contemporary China, which is the leading scholarly journal on China. His many, many books as author, editor, and co-editor include, just to name a few, China's New Global Strategy, published in 2019, China in Africa. I was actually present, as you'll recall, Sam, for the conference held at the University of Denver on which that book was based. So I recall those early discussions very, very vividly. Sam's other books include The Making of China's Foreign Policy in the 21st Century, China and the United States, Cooperation and Competition in Northeast Asia, and China-U.S. Relations Transformed. Okay, a note about the format, Lorena has already mentioned, but I'll just give you a sense of what's about to follow. I'm going to pose a handful of questions to the speakers about the particular regions that they study. And then we're going to, there will be an exchange amongst the speakers. And then we're going to move to audience Q&A, which will be moderated by Lorena. So you don't have to wait until that portion of today's program begins. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Lorena will keep track of all the questions that come in, and then we will move to audience Q&A. So one note also about the discussion, the idea of today's forum is, there's a lot of discussion going on about what to expect from the Biden administration, right, in terms of foreign policy. Every couple of hours, I seem to get an email about a Zoom panel on this topic. But what I really wanted to do with today's forum is to engage with a group of experts who are particularly interested in the question of what should the Biden administration do. This is not just what's likely to happen. This is a normative discussion about what actually is the best course of action for the Biden administration. So I'd like to start with you, Zachariah, and talk a bit about Africa, which, as you know, and let me say that Zachariah has co-authored an incredibly salient and forcefully argued article in a recent issue of Dissent magazine. The article is titled "A New Direction for U.S. Foreign Policy in Africa." It's co-authored with Jason Stearns at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And the two of you can give a number of really interesting points in this essay, Zachariah. You say that in many ways, of course, the Biden administration needs to undo much of the neglect and damage that the Trump administration has done. But you also point out that the Trump administration, in many ways, as odious as some of its rhetoric was really continuing the broad contours of U.S. policy towards Africa going back to the end of the Cold War. So before we get into lots of detail about what you propose for the Biden administration, can you give us a picture of what those contours of U.S. policy towards Africa have been since the end of the Cold War?
Sure. Thank you, Danny, and thank you all for joining us today. It's really wonderful to be here with such a great group of panelists, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think, the way that we approached the piece in Dissent was to try to look, pretty closely at administrations since the end of the Cold War. So really going back to the first Bush administration, and I think really sort of catching a firmer hold under the Clinton administration, and to sort of see how Africa has been treated across both Republican and Democratic administrations. And I think one of the things that was fairly striking was the level of consistency across the different regimes, regardless of whether they were of Democratic or Republican background. And I think, what is surprising about how Africa gets treated in these broader discussions around U.S. foreign policy is that Africa is, on one hand, always treated as an exception, as if it's a different place altogether, that it's somewhere outside of the world itself. When we talk about, for example, U.S. relationships to France or Mexico or to India, we of course weigh the pros versus the cons. We understand that there are trade-offs involved in each of these interactions. Yet when we come to Africa, we tend to assume that our primary relationship to the continent is humanitarian, that we are only there to do good, that it is fundamentally a site in which the U.S. engages in various forms of saviorism, this idea that Africa needs to be saved and it must be saved by outsiders and specifically Westerners. And what that has done in terms of U.S. foreign policy towards the continent is that it really creates a narrative where we don't have a critical understanding of the different roles that the U.S. is actually playing across African countries. And if we look more closely what the U.S. is actually doing beyond the rhetoric of do-gooderism that I think defines how we talk about U.S. foreign policy towards Africa, what we see is that pretty consistently across both Republican and Democratic regimes, there have been two cardinal principles for how U.S. foreign policy has engaged Africa. The first, I'd say, is a relentless push towards neoliberal economic policies, so a really strong aversion to any sort of redistributive policies on the continent, any efforts by African governments to take control over their economies. Instead, consistently, we have pushed African governments to open up their markets, to reduce spending on social services, to increase access to natural resources, which of course remain the primary commodity that African countries export to the international community. And I think that's been completely consistent across both the Democratic and Republican administrations that we've had. The second primary focus in terms of US policy towards Africa has been driven by security, and specifically the war on terror. And there again, what you see is that despite this rhetoric of the US wanting to engage in humanitarian or other types of actions, that primarily what we've been doing is using African countries in order to achieve our own security goals around the war on terror. And as a result, we've turned a number of African countries, whether Somalia, Libya, of course, and many others, most of the Sahel countries, for example, Niger, Mali, and others, into sites in which we are fighting the proxy battles of the war on terror. And as a result, we have increased our military presence across the continent. We have a huge number of clandestine secret bases in Africa. We engage in a variety of different actions in Africa. Libya in 2012, of course, was perhaps the most prominent because it went so badly. But those types of actions have not really dissipated after the Libya intervention and have really only continued. And so we see an increasing clandestine footprint for the US military across the continent in the name of fighting the war on terror. And so I think, just to sum, there's this huge contradiction. On one side, most Americans, even policymakers, think that what we're doing in Africa is primarily humanitarian, but most Africans that I've interacted with, intellectuals and policymakers, view US engagement with African countries or with their countries in a much more instrumental fashion. They emphasize the ways in which the US is constantly forging alliances with autocratic regimes like that of Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who's one of our closest allies in the war on terror, that often leads to very brutal treatment of African populations, both politically, but also I want to emphasize economically in terms of our relentless push for neoliberal economic policies on the continent.
Right, thanks. And I want to just quickly follow up with you on that, Zachariah, where you point out in the article that much like Latin America during the 2000s, many African countries, once drawn into the US orbit, are drifting out of it. You go on to point out specifically that China, for example, has become Africa's largest trading partner, and it has and is expanding its influence with $143 billion in loans and the construction of 48 Confucius Institutes, language and cultural centers, so soft power as well as economic power. You also point out China is not the only player. It's the one that gets most of the headlines, but India, Malaysia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia have similarly expanded their presence on the continent, and Russia is now increasing its involvement. Now, this is what's particularly interesting, though. You go on to point out that the net effect of these changes is that African governments are no longer bound to the United States or its European partners. That sounds like perhaps a good thing, right? A sort of post-American constellation of power in Africa. You say that African leaders regularly forum shop for support, playing external powers off each other in order to negotiate better terms of engagement. Again, sounds encouraging. But then you make a really sharp point that this international climate has, you say that this rarely translates into better conditions for the African people. This international climate has actually helped fuel a rise in authoritarianism, political oppression, and economic inequality. Can you explain this apparent paradox?
Sure. So I think that, as I said in my previous response, the ways in which the Western powers have traditionally engaged with African countries has been highly paternalistic, deeply influenced by the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and I think led the West to take for granted that African countries will always seek to have a relationship to them. And I think by and large, these were instrumental relationships, relationships that benefited the West more than they benefited African countries, despite the rhetoric around what the West was doing in Africa. But that being said, the one thing that the West did do, and I would emphasize that this was often hypocritical, but there was some effort to put pressure on African governments when they started to violate their own population's human rights and engage in violence against their own people. What we've seen, from Uganda to Sudan to Ethiopia to many other countries that are increasingly forging relationships to countries in Asia, China in particular, but as you mentioned, many other places, that this rhetorical concern for the human rights of Africans has largely disappeared from the discourse altogether. So as countries in Africa started to reach out to China and sort of forge these much deeper relationships to Asian countries, some of which were authoritarian in their orientation, the West stopped even pushing this rhetoric around human rights, stopped pushing this rhetoric around respecting the needs of the civilian populations, and instead have engaged in this process of what I would call a race to the bottom, right? Wherein it's become a highly instrumental set of relationships in which countries around the world are really trying to engage with African countries primarily to see what it is that they can get from the relationship. And what this has done, unfortunately, has really emboldened and empowered authoritarian leaders across the continent who now no longer have to deal with pressure from the West around democracy and human rights, but rather can simply choose which of these partners they want to engage with based on the terms of the agreement. In other words, they are free now to forum shop, and often will abandon one partner for another if they feel that that partner is putting pressure on them to behave in ways that they don't want to. And sadly, the real losers here in many cases are their own country's populations, who no longer have an international community that seems particularly invested in their welfare.
So you paint this rather bleak and disconcerting picture of this kind of these problems that Africa faces. You also bring up some pretty unnerving statistics about the ways in which the forecast doesn't look great for Africa demographically, environmentally. You say that poverty in Africa is more widespread than anywhere else in the world. The World Bank estimates that 87% of the world's extreme poor will be in Africa by 2030. 87% of the world's extreme poor in Africa in just 10 years. And that, and then you go on to talk about some of the climate refugees that we're likely to see and the displacement and so forth. And yet, despite all of this, or because of this rather bleak picture, you and Jason Stearns go on to argue that now is the time for a progressive reset in relations with the continent. And you lay out 4 basic kind of principles or elements of what that progressive reset would look like. Could you briefly walk us through that?
Sure. I mean, I think I won't go through all 4 points, but I think the key thing that we want to emphasize, and it is correct that we don't shy away from some of the negative trends that we see across the continent, but I am not a pessimist, right? I study Africa, I engage with African political figures because I think Africa is the future, right? It is the future of humanity, and in many ways, what we're seeing in many parts of the continent, many countries across Africa, is the rise of people-centric movements, right? Africa is the youngest continent. It is the continent with the largest age gap between its peoples and its rulers. And there is tremendous energy around a whole host of issues. We see movements for democracy. We see movements against climate change, against militarism, unfolding in numerous different African countries. In my research with Adam Branch, we found that in over 40 of Africa's 55 countries, there have been large-scale popular movements that have been able to sustain themselves across years. And they are, to me, the real future of not only the African continent, but of the human population. And so I think that this sort of disenchantment with government is widespread. So the question then is, what should the U.S. be doing about this? And for me, as you sort of pointed out with the previous question, There is one model, and I think this is what we're seeing already happening in DC, that views the U.S. role as an additional competitor, to view the Chinese or the Saudis or the Indians or whoever is trying to play in the African space as countries that we need to go toe-to-toe with, right? That we need to try to engage with them in terms of security and economic policy in ways that make the US more attractive than what is on offer from these other countries. And what we suggest in the piece is that instead of viewing it as a zero-sum game focused on economics and security, that what the US could do, I'm not convinced that they will do under the Biden administration, but we can come to this, is instead really take seriously our historic rhetoric around democracy and human rights and use that as our advantage in the African context. We can't compete with the Chinese in terms of preferential loans to African governments. What we can do is really take seriously the idea that we are a democracy, that we know this from surveys, the vast majority of Africans prefer democratic government to any other form of government, and that they may be our partners rather than the authoritarian elites. And that if we could have a foreign policy that genuinely, not simply rhetorically, but genuinely embodies a moral value around democratization, around people-centric policies, then that will be our advantage. Perhaps not in the short term, but in the long run, and especially if we want to play the long game with the very young populations in African countries, that is our best approach going forward.
Again, I want to plug this article that Zachariah and his co-author Jason Stearns have in the fall 2020 issue of Dissent magazine, titled "A New Direction for U.S. Foreign Policy in Africa." The article is available online for free. Now I'd like to move to Latin America. Mariano, before we can talk about what is to be done in terms of the Biden administration's agenda, policy agenda towards Latin America, I think we have to talk about what needs to be undone. And you do that in this piece that you wrote for the Chatham House website, in which you outline some of the core issues. I should say that you published this piece on September 1st. It appears that you knew something that many others, those of us in the U.S., were not quite so confident about, namely that Biden would win the election. But you published this as something of a memo for the incoming Biden administration. So Mariano, can you walk us through what it is that you think needs to be undone in terms of the Trump administration's legacy towards Latin America?
Yes, thank you, Danny. Thank you very much, and thank you for this very kind invitation. Let me say, first of all, that as a follow-up what Zachariah just said, is also interesting to see that in the case of Latin America, also Trump has been a very, I would say, brutal administration, but there are also some continuities and continuations from US foreign policy towards the region. I mean, since the 80s, the 90s, the US has been not completely doing a disengagement from Latin America, but the old relationship from the 50s, the 60s, that we all remember, for example, for the people that were born in Latin America, in terms of the US, that kind of the United States that organized the coup d'etat in Chile, for example, in 1973, that United States changed a lot. I would say that has not been, in the last at least 3 decades, has not been a one homogeneous United States. I mean, the globalization of capitalism has fragmented the interest. So you have corporations that are very interested in moving, for example, then moving the production to China or to Central America, other corporations to remain in the US. You have governments that has been more interested in other regions, particularly the shift of the interest of the United States from Latin America, for example, to the Middle East. You have also different actors. I mean, the fragmentation of international politics has been very clear in the case of the relationship between the US and Latin America. You have not only the government and different agencies in the US governments, but you have also other actors, the corporations that I just mentioned. You have religious groups, you have NGOs, you have the sector of philanthropy, and you have various actors, a lot of them, and a lot of different interests at the same time. So it's interesting to see, and I will return to this point, and to see what would be the role of the of the Biden administration, I'm sorry, in terms of the future, I would say, relationship of the United States with Latin America. But before going to that point, let me answer to your question. I mean, Trump's administration policy towards Latin America has been mainly about stopping migration, expulsing the migrants as far as is possible, making the life impossible for millions of immigrants in the United States. All, I would say is real and at the same time symbolic in terms of what we all know very well about this administration that has been very much racist and that use the Latin American migration, the Latinos migration, as a target, to blame them for many of the internal problems in the US. The second point has been a continuation, what I mentioned before, a continuation, for example, of the drug war that started with Richard Nixon and continues until today. The third sector has been trade. I mean, Trump used a kind of transactional policy to reform, and it will be a lot to discuss how far has been the reform of NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, but has been a very, I would say, publicistic policy, a policy just to show that he is a big businessman doing and cutting different deals with Mexico and Canada. It's very important that he tried to, he reversed, as a matter of fact, Obama's new diplomacy with Cuba. And in the case of Colombia, the Trump administration has been pushing the Duque's government, which is a strong ally of the United States in general, and has been an ally of the Trump administration, but has been pushing the Duque's government in terms of restarting fumigation of the coca fields. And then something that is really very important and dramatic, everything is dramatic about the Trump administration, but this is something I would like to stress, is how the administration used foreign aid, particularly to put a lot of pressure on weak countries as Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, in terms that they should stop their own people not to try to be migrants, not to emigrate to the United States. So put a lot of pressure through trade to Mexico, to the government of López Obrador, in terms of, so what the United States did, as a matter of fact, something that in a more elegant way, the European Union also has been doing, has been to move the border southbound. I mean, from the Rio Grande, move the border to the south and move the border to southern Mexico. And also, not being that enough, has been putting this pressure using development aid with these poor countries in Central America, saying either you stop the people, your own people, or we will cut the funding. That's something that he did in any way. What Biden could do or will do about it? Well, first of all, we need to remember that for the Biden administration, Latin America, and this is also these trends of continuity that I mentioned before, the Latin America and Central America will not be a priority for the Biden administration. Some of the issues related to Latin America will be. So, first of all, I think that that Biden and Kamala Harris, they will try to stop the human rights violations that are occurring in the border with all this crazy and terrible and sadistic policy on human rights that the Trump administration has been pursuing. Second is something that the Biden administration announced, that's why I mentioned it in my article in Chatham House last September, is this big plan, $4 billion, this big plan of development for Central America. Explicitly, the plan is oriented to to strengthen the economic life of these countries, trying to create jobs, and trying to, I would say, nicely deter the people not to emigrate. A third point will be also the confrontation with China. I mean, it's something that also the Trump administration has been doing in a very non-elegant way, I would say. And now the Trump administration will try to do it probably in a way that Zachariah mentioned at the end of his presentation. I mean, assuming that they need to share the field in Latin America with China, a little bit with Russia, a little bit with other countries, emerging powers, including Turkey, for example, or India, and that will try to be the main player, but assuming that, you know, as a matter of fact, things has been changing in the world and will not be the only player as it was in the past. And the fourth point, of course, is Venezuela. We can talk perhaps lately about this, but in Venezuela, one important point in conversations that I had with people that is now will be part of the Biden's government, they mention explicitly that the threat of military intervention will be lifted. That will be a first very interesting step, but there are many others that we can mention later that the Biden administration could do in order to facilitate, I would say, if not the solution, at least something of a first step towards a solution in the very complex Venezuelan situation. And last but not least, of course, is Cuba. I mean, hopefully, the Biden administration will reestablish the relationship with Cuba. But I think that Cuba is part of this, I would say, set of very perverse measures that the Trump administration and particularly Mike Pompeo, the State Secretary, has been adopting and taking along the years, and particularly in the last few days, in terms towards Iran, towards the Houthis and in Yemen, in the Middle East, towards Cuba, mentioning Cuba as a center of terrorism, which is absolutely crazy. And so I don't think that with the establishing the relationship will be something that would happen tomorrow, but hopefully step by step is something to be done. If you ask me what Biden should do, I think that the most important thing for me is that Biden and Harris and the full administration will prepare something that I would like to see is that they will set and prepare the field in order that their administration will be a transition between the imperial US in Latin America to a post-imperial US in the relationship with this continent. And this would not be easy, but there are ways using human rights, stopping this kind of very privileged relationships, for example, between the Pentagon and the Colombian militaries, changing the war on drugs, that is a kind of war on terror, but on drugs, helping now for the economic recovery after the COVID-19 and the debt crisis in Latin America, reestablishing the relationship with Cuba. There are ways, very short and mid-term, that could help to set up, I would say, this new role for Latin America in the region.
Thank you for that very thorough overview of the Latin American arena, Mariano. And you mentioned Pompeo's, what you might call these parting shots of Pompeo's vis-a-vis Cuba and Yemen, which have been described as a kind of diplomatic vandalism in the final days of the Trump administration. And this connects us very directly to our next discussion with Sarah about the Middle East, because, you know, it seems very much that one speculation is that Pompeo's designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism was designed precisely to position him, to hamstring the Biden administration before it even takes office, and to lock it into this very defensive and awkward posture, whereby if it decides to undo this designation, it will be seen, especially in Florida, as soft on terrorism and soft on communism and soft on dictatorship. And so this may very well be a maneuver that Pompeo is making as a sort of to establish his candidacy for the presidency in 2024. But Sarah, to move to the Middle East, where Pompeo similarly designated the Houthis in Yemen as a terrorist organization, which similarly, although a purely symbolic move that seems to that really has zero possibility of changing the equation in Yemen, except for the humanitarian nightmare that it could cause in what is already the worst humanitarian crisis on planet Earth. Could push even more people into starvation. But what I want to ask you, Sarah, is I think there are two. I mean, as the Biden administration takes office, there's the immediate question of Yemen, and the larger question of which Yemen, I think, is part. The immediate question is, can you tell us, what do you think the Biden administration's policy on the war in Yemen, in which the United States has been complicit since 2015, predating the Trump administration? Give us a sense of what the Biden administration is likely to do and what you think it should do on the Yemen war.
I think that the Biden administration has already stated very clearly that one of their goals will be to end America's participation in the Yemen war. It stuns me that 5 years into this war, I would probably venture to guess that the vast majority of Americans have no idea that America is a participant in the war in Yemen, not just a supplier of arms to the Saudi-led coalition, but actually a party to the war, particularly under international law, because it has continued to provide intelligence support and intelligence assistance to the Saudi-led coalition, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as providing targeting assistance, and until recently, which is something that actually Pompeo stopped, refueling support. And that is why I think that the Biden administration has promised to end its own role in the war in Yemen, which will be a very welcome development. But it's also promised to end the supply of arms, the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. I think that that is very unlikely to actually happen. I think that we will see a much stronger rhetoric on Saudi Arabia, probably not on the UAE, which is an equally bad actor in the region. But because the Biden administration is also prioritizing a new nuclear agreement with Iran, which will also take years to accomplish, and a lot of unwinding of the same sorts of sanctions that have been applied on Ansar Allah for the Houthis, or in Venezuela, or in Cuba, I think that you will start seeing the Biden administration making concessions to the Saudi, UAE, Israel, Egypt coalition in order to create space to negotiate a deal with Iran. So just as it was that the United States joined the war in Yemen as a concession to Saudi Arabia and the UAE to reward them for not speaking out against the nuclear agreement with Iran under Obama, so I predict that the Biden administration will not cut off Saudi Arabia, certainly won't cut off the UAE in terms of continued arms sales as a concession to trying to get a new JCPOA deal done. So that's the narrow picture in Yemen. Of course, the sanctions will not just have a catastrophic humanitarian impact, but they will have a very severe and dire effect on peace negotiations. There really leaves no room and creates one more massive obstacle for Ansar Allah to negotiate any kind of peace agreement with the Saudis, particularly because they're not losing. The Saudis have made no gains. In fact, they've only lost in the past 5 years, and there's even less incentive for them now that there are these sanctions applied. But I would want to note, and this is really my critique of the critiques of the sanctions designation of Ansar Allah in Yemen, And I would say, really across the board, and domestically and internationally, the designation of the Houthis has been widely condemned and criticized. But the condemnations, even from progressive or liberal foreign policy analysts, experts, human rights organizations, has been purely on humanitarian grounds and on, maybe political diplomatic grounds as a problem for future negotiations for peace. But what has been missing, and what I think is the much more serious question, particularly because it applies globally, is this completely inappropriate, illegitimate use of terrorism designations and sanctions that didn't start with the Trump administration, that have been expanded wildly to cover over 35 countries in the world, affecting, I would say, probably 95%. I think there were only 2 white countries, but 95% affecting people of color around the world who are suffering the consequences of sanctions. Through now a new venue, which is these terrorism designations. And that has been a remarkably consistent feature of the Trump administration and the Obama administration and the Clinton administration. We just go on and on. The Bush administration has been one more exponential rollout of these disastrous sanctions policies that are really just a tool of warfare and are used as bargaining chips. So most recently, of course, the US removed Sudan from the terrorism designation list in exchange for Sudan making peace, if that's what we're going to call it, or entering into the Abraham Accords. So just one more example of how these sanctions and terror designations are an instrument of war and instrumentalized for political ends that have absolutely nothing to do with the original designation.
Sarah, you have been one of the most forceful advocates of the US resetting its relationship with Saudi Arabia on a very fundamental way, not just with respect to specific instances of Saudi Arabia's repression of its dissidents at home, on which you've been particularly outspoken, its war crimes and catastrophic role in the Yemen war, which the US, as you've pointed out, has been complicit. But beyond these specific theaters, you've really called for a fundamental rethinking of the US relationship with Saudi Arabia more geostrategically in terms of the regional geopolitics, if you will, of the Middle East. In a recent piece, though, you make a really bedeviling point about this. You say the reality is that military and diplomatic support for Saudi Arabia, including the presence of American troops in the kingdom, billions in arms sales, intelligence, and targeting assistance in the Yemen war, as well as diplomatic protection from international isolation for its atrocious human rights record, creates an endless bind for America. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by this endless bind?
Sure. I mean, the endless bind is that so long as the United States continues to be a partner with these authoritarian, abusive governments, we provide them with military support, we provide them with diplomatic support, we provide them with military troops to protect their undemocratic, unrepresentative, lacking basic legitimacy governments, we become tethered to them. We become tethered to their abuses, we become tethered to their policies, and we become tethered to their success and their failure. The most recent situation, of course, is that now in dealing with Saudi Arabia, you're no longer just dealing with Saudi Arabia, and you can't have a relationship just with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel and Egypt are in one alliance. And so even if Biden wanted to change American policies towards Saudi Arabia, which he has very specifically promised to do, he has very specifically promised to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But if he were to try to do that, the bind we're in now is that we have not only the defense industry, the military industrial complex, that will strongly lobby against any change in that relationship because they benefit and profit from continued arms sales. But it will also face the onslaught of an Israel lobby and a UAE lobby, now probably the second most powerful lobby in Washington after Israel, that will lobby against any change in the relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think it's also important to note, and you know, this is something that I have observed over the past several years, is that interestingly, legislators, Republican and Democrat, have been willing to call out Saudi Arabia. The US Congress, Democrat and Republican, on very rare instance of a complete bilateral synchronicity, voted twice to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia and end the war in Yemen. And there's been a willingness to publicly critique Saudi Arabia, probably because there's a memory of 9/11 and Saudi Arabia's and Saudi Arabian citizens' role in that. But probably for some elements of Islamophobia tied in there. But I think it's very important to note that there is no intellectual or political distinction between the harm the United States does when it sells arms to Saudi Arabia than when it sells arms to the UAE, or for that matter, when it sells arms to Israel. These are rogue states that are responsible for terrible atrocities in the region. And the United States is complicit in these atrocities of these governments because it is enabling them, and in some cases is actively participating in them. Without a fundamental rethink of the consequences of US support for what is now a very powerful authoritarian alliance in the Middle East, that is actually quite unprecedented. It will be very hard for Biden to change one aspect or a relationship with one country like Saudi Arabia, because it is bound into this because of its relationship with these other governments. Can't hear you, Danny.
Cannot hear you.
Thank you very much, and sorry about that. Thank you for that overview, Sarah, which is in fact is quite disconcerting. Sam, I'd like to bring you in to talk about the Chinese piece of this puzzle. China has already come up several times in this discussion, which I don't think is an accident in terms of its role in Africa in particular, and in terms of the larger story of how, as Mariano and Zachariah were pointing out, that so many parts of the world are now moving towards a sort of post-American relationship with the outside world, and China, of course, is central to that story. But before we get into that, I'd really like to ask you, Sam, about the concerns that so many people have that with the Biden administration taking over at this moment, that you have an increasing a drumbeat towards a new Cold War between China and the United States. What's your sense of the dangers of a new Cold War between the two powers?
Indeed, the talking about emerging Cold War and a bipolar competition has come up in the last 4 years in the Trump administration. In fact, this is not something out of blue because of the relationship between China and US has come to a very confrontational level. For many years, US had some hope China will be integrated into the international community and more like America, and could share the values and also have a complementary economic interest between these two countries. However, this has never come up. China has been developed from a very backward, isolated revolutionary state into a more open and more integrated country in the international community. But China has not changed its authoritarian governance and even become more oppressive domestically since Xi Jinping came to office. And also China has become a rival to the United States in all front. In fact, as you said, predate the Trump administration. In my mind, at least 3 aspects of confrontation has been developed very intensively. One is economic competition. For many years, China was basically in the lower end of the production chain or value chain on the labor-intensive and manufacture production, and the US at the high end in the service and high-tech parts. China has now developed its own high-tech and also needs to compete on the high-tech front and also move up the production chain to change US dominance. And also US has lost a lot of jobs in manufacture by Chinese competition. So economically, these 2 countries have come to head-to-head competition. And also security and geopolitical, geostrategic front. China for many years basically was a continental country. Its defense and most was the coastal defense and look inward to the Asian continent and also inward toward itself. But China now has developed into what they call maritime big power, and in the 21st century, and looking for its survival space. US has long been a maritime power, especially in the Pacific or Western Pacific. China now has developed its military capacity, especially modern naval capacity and Air Force, try to break what they call the island chains, the first island chain from Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, which US has dominated that area for half a century or maybe 1 century. And China tried to break the first island chain to the second island chain, all the way to Central Pacific of the third island chain. Taiwan is part of that, Japan is part of that, the Philippines, Southeast Asian countries are all in that front. So that has come directly confrontation challenge to US interests in the Pacific, and then now US called the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, as we said earlier. And US in that case has seen China as a huge rival and challenge to its maritime interests and also the overall global interests in that context. The third part is so-called ideology or the development model. Quite a few earlier speakers, Zachariah and also Sarah, talked about authoritarian alliance in Africa, in the Middle East, also in Latin America. US tried to defend its liberal democratic allies. China is a very successful authoritarian government in the last several decades to develop from as poor country as the African country, as we talk about those countries. Those countries remain poor, but China has become the second largest economy in the world and under the one-party authoritarian rule. So that's a huge challenge to the US liberal democratic developments globally and also in Asia Pacific regionally. And China's state capitalism has been not only successful inside China, but also accepted by many other countries, including those in Africa, including those in Middle East. Iran in the Middle East is a very strong partner in other parts of Russia. Those kind of authoritarian access of countries have somehow developed around China. And so US itself, our own democracy now is in big trouble. And sliding had a lot of problems. So this kind of challenge from China in the so-called development model part, I avoid this ideology because it's not communism, just a way of life, just a way of economic development. And US has facing this challenge. So predate the Trump administration, China and US, the relationship has come to the tipping point. We have to find ways to resolve that problem. And Trump came to office, discovered this problem, but intensified and making this situation even worse by confronting China on all fronts and launching, as you said, a new Cold War in a very well-orchestrated campaign. He's a national security advisor, he's a Attorney General and FBI director and the Secretary of State all gave a very strong Cold War type of speeches talking about China, not only as a rival, but as a communist state. And the US is going to overthrow, in fact, try to incite the Chinese people to overthrow the communist regime. That's a very typical Cold War type of confrontation and also declaration. And China response to this is not, it's tit for tat to a certain extent, but on the other hand, China has not accepted the Cold War energy because China has criticized the US as a so-called Cold War mentality and trying to push this relationship into a new Cold War, which they don't think we are in. And also, I don't think China is ready to fight the new Cold War. So on the new Cold War front, I want to make a little bit elaboration on this. Indeed, the world today in the second decade or third decade now of the 21st century is clearly developing into a bipolarity. US and China are the only two superpowers that have the capacity and likely hold to dominate the world. That's for sure. But there are many other big powers, I call great powers, like European Union itself is a pole of power, and Russia itself is reemerged as a very important power. And also some emerging powers like India and Iran, South Africa, Brazil, all those countries are acting somehow independently in this kind of bipolar world, but clearly US and China are the largest economies and in all dimensions, except nuclear capacity, because China nuclear gap with the US still far, not Cold War. The Soviet Union reached the parity of the nuclear capacity to the US in 1977, and China is still far away on the nuclear front, nuclear deterrence front. But on other dimensions, economic, military, political, all the dimensions, these are two largest powers. They are fighting in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, confrontation on Indo-Pacific, on the islands, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, and other parts of Asian Pacific, and also globally. Now, our colleagues talk about Africa, talk about Latin America, talk about the Mid East. These are the only two superpowers, and each try to launch their own alliances. China has one Belt, one Road, and launched AIB, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and all of those institutions, Shanghai organizations, all those US is not part of that. And recently they also put together RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, 15 states, US is not part of that. And China now, this year, 2020, also reached a very historical agreement with the European Union for the investment agreement, and US is not part of that. So these two countries are confrontation in confronting each other in all front, every part of the world. But my argument is that this US-China bipolarity or rivalry is fundamentally different from the Cold War as we know it. There are several aspects of a difference I could mention that. One is during the Cold War, the ideology confrontation was the fundamental feature. Each of the two superpowers led a kind of a camp, people call it camp, based upon shared ideology. And each tried to promote their ideology in the Soviet part of communism and the US side of capitalism or democracy to the whole world. Try to fight for every country to overthrow, the Soviet Union tried to overthrow democracies in the US camp. The US tried to gain countries from communist camp. This is not the case between US and China. China is not a communist country anymore, although it's still ruled on the communist party. I always some joke to my colleagues, it's a Confucianist party, a CCP, Chinese Confucius Party, Chinese Consumers Party, I mean CCP. You can use all those labels, but communist, because and China is a one-party rule, but it's a state capitalism. China is next to the US, have the number of billionaires. I just saw a number today. I thought that this even talk China has more billionaires than the United States, and it's the second largest. It's a market driven, but not decided by market, but it's part of the global economy, and China benefits so much from the US net liberal international order. And China has promoted so-called its development model, the China model, under one-party rule to use the market. It's mostly, I think, try to legitimize their own domestic role and also ask the international community to accommodate or to recognize China's Communist Party or authoritarian role instead of try to build the communist regime or China type of regime all over the world. It's very different. It's kind of I don't want to use the term, some kind of defensive from that perspective, because China is more afraid the liberal values than Americans or Western countries is afraid of the Chinese values. That's what I've been in this country 30 years. When I came to this country, I was, went back to China, people always talk, you were watched by Western countries. Western countries try to subvert the Chinese government. Now, this kind of reversed. The Western countries are afraid of China, but that's not the case. It's not that case. China is not that powerful. And I don't think Chinese leaders, they think they are, maybe they can say that, but I don't think that that's the case. So that's one part of the difference. Ideology is not in the commanding height of the competition. The second aspect I would argue is that the power balance is very delicate. Yes, China is second largest economy, but it's far from the US. And the people say by purchase parity 2014, China took over the United States. And by nominal GDP, China will take over the US in the next 10 or 20 years. I don't care about those things because per capita, the resources China could use for the competition is very limited. And China per capita income last year was only a little bit more than 10,000 US dollars. China had 1.4 billion population, US only 300 million population. And US per capita, according to World Bank, is more than $6,000. And China's per capita even behind Russia, far behind Japan and other countries. And also China has faced a lot of domestic internal problem, aging population and corruption and environmental problems and also political succession struggle. Xi Jinping looks very powerful. Yes, he concentrates all the powers into his own hand and become lifetime president. But that's a problem. If he is ill, if he is dying, what will happen to China? He eliminated all the succession roles. So China will have a civil war. China will have a coup d'etat, and the Chinese economy will be suffering. So if I'm a Chinese leaders, I will not be that confident. We cannot. Yes, China is rising, but we cannot take China's rise for granted. A lot of problems could unravel China's rise, and Chinese leaders know that. They know they cannot achieve a hegemony as the US did. And from the material and the economic, military, everything aspect, China could project the power mostly not far beyond its home region, as in Pacific. US is real global power in spite of all the problems, domestic problems, but China is far from overtaking the United States. And also China does not have many allies. The Soviet Union at least had quite a number of alliances and its own organization, some kind of council for mutual economic assistance, Eastern European countries. China does not have those allies. The only powerful ally for China is Russia. But their relationship now is developed so quickly. Maybe Iran is another country. I don't want to get into that Middle East part. And the Asia Pacific only ally is North Korea, which is a more kind of liability than an asset for China. China is fighting with Australia now, with India, with Vietnam, with many countries in this whole world and this area. All those countries with China's relationship from kind of suspicious and hostile, and very few China could call them allies in confrontation with the United States. So from diplomatic, economic, and ideological, everything, I don't think is a typical Cold War type. But I also finally, I want to emphasize, I want to mention that although China is not in a position to fight a Cold War with the United States, and is the structure bipolarity is somehow different from the Cold War structure. But the US cannot defeat China easily either. Trump said he can win Cold War easy. However, I don't think the US win the Cold War. I will even argue that US lost the Cold War with China because China is not the former Soviet Union, for sure. And China is the second large economy, and Russia, militarily, maybe Russia was powerful, but economically, Russia is far from China today as a big partner. I mean, number one, number two partner of most countries in the world. And China has also is a domestic support. It's one-party system, everything. It has a lot of problems with the Western countries. But at this time, I will say, still get very strong domestic support, especially this, the pandemic, to handle the crisis, this kind of one-party authoritarianism has been somehow more effective, like it or not, than the so-called Marxes in handle these problems. Initially, although China got some problems, and China's neighboring intellectuals complained, now they discovered China is doing much better than all other countries. Today or yesterday, China published its 2020 GDP growth, 2.3%. The only country in the world had a positive that level of GDP growth. And Chinese economy has slowed down for sure, but it's still dynamic. And it's not easy for the US in that case to end this so-called rivalry like Cold War with one side to collapse. And I don't think the Chinese regime, Chinese economy, Chinese government will collapse at any time soon. And so in that case, I will argue that the bipolarity is a durable variable world structure. Both China and the US have to face each other. China will go nowhere. US will go nowhere. And these two countries still share a lot of interests, although confront on many other issues, but still share a lot of interests like climate change, the pandemic, many other issues. And China will not decline or collapse, and US will not collapse either. So the argument here is that these two countries, Joe Biden and Chinese leaders, I don't think they like each other, but they have to damned to live together. and find ways to avoid a new Cold War. Nuclear powers, China, US, coming to a new Cold War, which could also come to a hot war. I mean, because they have not established all those kind of codes to avoid incidents on the sea or ocean, everything. It's dangerous, really dangerous. So I'll stop here if we can talk more details about the new administration should do or is going to do.
Sam, thank you for that, all of this food for thought. Thank you to all of our panelists for such a tour de force of these 4 respective regions of the world and what the Biden administration faces as it takes office on the foreign policy front. I would like to now open things up to our audience. Knowing our audience for these programs, I have no doubt that there are all sorts of interesting and provocative questions awaiting our panelists. And so I'm going to hand things over to my partner in crime, Lorena Neal, to moderate the audience Q&A.
Thank you very much. And just as a reminder, we do have a lot of interesting questions so far, but if you have any you've been sitting on or you want to share or you think of along the way, please feel free to add them in. Our first question today for the panelists regards Biden's choices thus far for the experts on foreign policy that he's added to his team. And what that foretells, his choices foretell a rehash of Obama's policies, including sort of a hawkish attitude, warfare via drones, deportations, neoliberal trade policies. Do you think there might be a rethinking on the part of some of these same people who will be reassuming these roles shortly? Or are you expecting Obama Part 3?
Now, it sounds like that question was not addressed to any particular panelist, so if we can let any of you respond. I know, Zachariah, we've discussed this, and in your dissent essay, you talk about Susan Rice and Samantha Power being likely figures to return from the Obama administration vis-a-vis Africa. And that was published before, in fact, both of them were named to the different positions they've now been named to. Do you want to take that, Zachariah?
Let me just be very quick. I think you know, the frequency with which we see ex-Obama officials being reappointed to high-level positions in the Biden administration is not surprising. Indeed, does foretell a continuity between what the Obama administration was doing and what the Biden administration is likely to do. I am particularly concerned as somebody who pays a lot of attention to the African continent, because you do have people like Susan Power who are back in these very influential positions, and I think, you know, did not acquit themselves particularly well during the Biden administration. Samantha Power, was appointed as the USAID administrator. You know, I think, and I would love to hear what Sarah has to say about this, but you know, in her memoir, for example, that came out just about a year ago, I don't believe she actually criticizes Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen at all in the entire book. And that, I think, is the kind of selective memory that many of these Obama officials will bring into the Biden administration as well. They have cast their time in power with a very rose-tinted view. And as somebody who has followed their careers, because many of them got their start working in the Africa space, you know, sometimes I think it's almost delusional in terms of how they have approached policy in the African context, where they view the U.S. as a uniquely moral actor and almost always understand U.S. intervention into African countries, including in the disastrous Libya intervention, as driven by purely moral and humanitarian concerns, with almost no self-reflection about the flaws and the massive imbroglios that those interventions have triggered, not only in Libya, but also across the entire West African sub-region. So I am not optimistic that we're going to see a new direction, but I will say, and it's the last thing I'll say, is that I hope that all of us can put pressure on these folks and really push back against the very elitist and I think very problematic type of foreign policy positions that these individuals have been associated with during their time in the Obama administration. And hopefully they won't continue that going forward, but I'm not super optimistic there.
Sarah, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I concur in that we are going to see an Obama 3.0, given the repeat cast of characters who occupied, shuffled the deck here, occupied similar positions in power from, the very top level to the assistant levels. And so, I think there has been at least a little bit of reflection on the Yemen war. Samantha Power and Wendy Sherman and Jake Sullivan and a few others who are now in the Biden administration issued this mea culpa letter signed by about 40 former Obama administration people, basically apologizing for getting us involved in the war in Yemen and explaining how they bungled it so badly. So I suppose that's a good thing, and that will take us back to getting out of the Yemen war. But overall, I think you're absolutely right, Zachariah, in that there continues to be this delusional thinking of the US as a benevolent actor in the Middle East, notwithstanding the catastrophes of the last 30 years. If you start just with the first Iraq War of 1991, which, by the way, today is the anniversary of, still this self-perception among the new appointees of the Biden administration of the United States as a democracy promoter. This notion that we can condition our military assistance or humanitarian assistance in order to, quote unquote, put pressure on abusive governments for reforms. And that is sort of the mantra, that is the narrative framework. The only problem with it is it's completely false. It's completely false that conditionality with military aid or economic aid actually ever works, because the harsh reality is that these governments are in a zero-sum game with their own countries, with their own populations. So every concession they make to the US, even should there be a demand, is grudgingly made and very dangerous for these governments. Results actually in shit collection. So for every American that's detained and then released as some kind of gift or concession, which is something the Trump administration also did, they arrest a couple more to throw out as concessions the next time someone comes criticizing them or demanding, quote unquote, reforms. And the second reason why it's completely delusional, this self-perception of the US as democracy promoter, is that in fact, in the Middle East and North Africa, and I think actually Africa and Latin America are better off than what the Middle East has faced. The US has been actually a democracy destroyer, has been an underminer of democracy, has been an underminer of human rights, because it supports governments whose only role is to oppress and tyrannize and maintain control over not just their populations, but other countries in which they're engaged in war, fully knowing that our continued support to these governments will result in harm to the people of the region, de-democratization, destruction of any spheres of free expression, political opposition, and doing that very openly and knowingly.
You inspired me to grab off my shelf this mini statue of Mohammad Mossadegh, just to make your point, Sarah. As I'm sure many, if not all of our audience know, Mohammad Mossadegh was the democratically elected and quite popular minister of Iran from 1951 to 1953. Who was then taken out in a coup d'etat in 1953, engineered by the United States and Britain in an event whose legacy continues to reverberate to this day. Lorena, why don't we take the next question?
Sure thing. I think this is another sort of general question that we can pose to the entire group of speakers here, and that is just leaning into what you were saying about the U.S.'s presumed moral leadership or leadership as a beacon of democracy, whether true or not in the past and increasingly untrue. Have we lost that leadership? position today. To what extent has the Trump administration played into that? To what extent has the recent attempted coup at the United States Capitol played into that? How do you think we are situated after these past 4 years or 2 weeks or whatever period of time the crazy things have been happening? And lately, I haven't checked Twitter in 2 hours. Everything could be totally different now. What effect do you think this has had on the U.S. position in the world? Yes, please. Mariano. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think that I would say that normally when you study international relations, it is at some point you come to learn that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, and I think that this is a very interesting rule to remember in the case of the United States. I mean, one interpretation about how the US is losing its hegemonic power and how it's losing also its legitimacy, for example, in the Middle East, as Sarah explained for many reasons, or for example, even in Latin America, where still the elites and still some politicians, in Europe it happens the same, they are still, I would say, always waiting for the US, for the signs from Washington to take decisions. For example, the Europeans towards the Middle East, or many governments and many politicians in Latin America. But the fact is that it's not only because there are other powers on the rise in the world, and now we live in a multipolar world, but the issue is also that internally, and it's something that many people in this audience knows better than me, the problem is that the United States has so many internal problems and fractures, so many issues. In any topic that you look at, it's very important, very interesting to see how there are fractures on race, there are fractures on legitimacy of the politicians and politics. There is a crisis of representation in politics. There is a crisis of infrastructure. I live in the US. The bridges are dangerous. The subways are not always functioning well. The bank system is a mess. I mean, and it's not any kind of anti-Americanism. It's just a fact that the US is a country that is imploding from inside. I'm not meaning, and I don't agree, and as a matter of fact, I wrote some articles recently about it. I don't agree that it's a failed state. You cannot compare, with all the respect for both countries, you cannot compare the US with Somalia. But at the same time, given the position of power of the United States, and given the legitimacy that had so far, and given this kind of moral authority that Sarah described very well before, not only internally, it's not only that some people now in the Biden administration or in the past in the Obama administration, they believe in that moral authority. The problem is that many people around the world also still think that it has this authority. And given that when you look at the failures, for example, in promotion of democracy, or even when you look at the failures, when I remember in some debates that I discussed with some people that say, well, this is still people on the left or on the right saying this is still in the most powerful country in the world, militarily speaking, which I fully agree in terms of the figures, but not in terms of the strategies. When you look at the wars that the US won already in the last 50 or 60 years, it's difficult to find a war that has been won. I mean, except the invasion of Grenada and except the invasion of Panama. So it's interesting to see that, and it's important, I think, that we will, I would say, reevaluate and starting to reevaluate the point that I made at the end of my first part of in this debate, in terms of either the U.S. or part of the U.S. or part of the elites in the U.S., they want it or not, we are moving in a post-imperial phase in the history of the United States. And either the politicians assume that, and hopefully some people in the Biden administration will do it, or they will fail again. And we will see in 4 years, again, in failure in foreign policy, and we could see a failure internally in domestic policies as well, if they not assume what I would say, it's fair to say that in the beginning of the Obama administration, Obama was, I mean, following, if I'm not wrong, was the first president that assumed a post-imperial role for the United States. But very quickly, the right, the conservatives, and even people, of course, in the Democratic Party, and it's interesting, paradoxically, people on the left as well, reclaiming and saying, no, it's still a very powerful country. It's the most powerful enemy in the world. Everybody was pushing Obama to assume the American exceptionalism and to assume, and in the second presidency, that, well, no, we're not in a post-imperial world. We are still the leader. And it's a confusion between having a lot of weapons, having nuclear weapons, and to be the leader of the world. And it's a very dramatic and dangerous mistake that what we are seeing now is not only for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is becoming very pragmatic. I mean, all the allies of the US is now thinking about cutting deals with the Chinese, cutting deals with the Russians, cutting deals with whoever, because they need to survive. And the US is now fighting its internal struggle, as we saw on the January the 6th in the images. And this is something that will continue. And that's why it's important that hopefully the new administration will be more conscious about it.
So let me jump in here. I think, unfortunately, the U.S. has not only abandoned global leadership, and also lost the moral leadership globally. This is predate the Trump administration. Trump only intensified this process. In fact, there are several aspects I think we can see how U.S. has lost this moral leadership globally. Since September 11, U.S. has, in fact, after the end of Cold War, U.S. has tried to do everything to maintain its so-called unipolar movement. And in the words of China and many other countries, to maintain U.S. hegemony, primacy globally, using democratic values or democracy as a cover to defend the U.S. Hegemonic capacity. And this has been somehow led to an overdraft of U.S. power. And that internal American people try to oppose American global leadership, oppose American international involvement. So U.S. has a superpower, has somehow overextended itself in this process. Second, the U.S. efforts to promote so-called liberal values and democracy have not always and very often produced positive results. So the color revolution, we all know that 10 years ago and also Africa in the Middle East really have not produced very positive democratic changes in those countries, only produced chaos. That's I really don't want to use the Chinese Communist Party's term, but that's what the term they used. And also, unfortunately, to a certain extent, reflect the reality. Third, U.S. has a double standard on the international arena on many issues. U.S. we try to promote a rules-based liberal international order. Yes, U.S. has worked so hard to make all those rules, but those rules only to bind other countries, not the United States. When those rules is in conflict with American interests, Americans ignore them. There are so many examples. For example, the Iraq War is a good example. And the only UN Security Council authorization is legitimate use of force. But US put together a coalition of willingness to fight such a big war, create a mess in the Middle East. In South China Sea, the US said, we have a freedom navigation, and we want all the countries to follow the UN clause, UN Convention on the Sea of Law. But US Congress has not ratified UN clause. US want other countries to follow the rules. The US does not want to subject itself to those rules. How could a leadership, China followed that. China learned that. So China ignored them because that's a privilege of big powers. Big power has that privilege to ignore international law. Might makes rights, unfortunately. And the US now, the 4 years Trump administration really destroyed all the hope for US to have a moral leadership globally. US Trump administration declared Cold War on China, tried to so-called rally those democratic allies and partners. Nobody followed US, even European Union countries did not follow that because they were so disappointed by the US withdrawing from Paris Accord for Climate Change, from UNESCO, from Iran deal, from PPP, Pacific Partnership, everything which US helped create, so-called liberal international order, US net to construct. US now become this not only destructor, but also try to dismantle everything on that. So now Joe Biden came to office, he said the America is back. But the world will see US with all the suspicions. How can we trust you 4 years after if a Trump type of people come back to office? All the US commitments, legal commitments will be broken again. How we can trust you? Joe Biden talked about we will have a democratic summit. He'll put that. The US is not democratic today, so people talk, you should have a domestic democratic summit first before US has a global democratic summit to let the world trust US. Really US, the Trump administration, I really not envy them, but I had all the hope for the Joe Biden administration to repair the 4 years and also last decades damage to US moral leadership, to US liberal values, to US democracy, to US global leadership. It's a big job, People have hope. I have hope too, but I don't know. We could hold that hope in the next 4 years or next 2 years. We have a midterm election in 2 years. So the Chinese, now they joke, Americans said American invaded America. America destroyed America. America defeated America. And America has to save America. So we have to see how America could put these things together in the next 2 years or 4 years. That's my hope. Come on, let's do it, But
Thank you very much. We do have a couple of China-specific questions. The first one does touch actually on all of the region's concerns, so I'll be interested to see if anyone else wants to jump in. And that is about how China's One Belt, One Road initiative may play a role in shaping US foreign policies around the globe in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. Do you foresee the Biden administration taking a different approach?
Okay, this is a verse for me. Let me. So the Belt Road Initiative started 2013 when Xi Jinping came to office. In fact, now has become the signature of his big power diplomacy. There are 3 different views about the Belt Road Initiative. One is a very much Chinese official view, and also some Western scholars agree with that, is the Chinese leadership to provide so-called global public goods and to help those countries in Eurasia, in other parts of the world. They have 6 economic corridors, and most non-Western countries to jump the China's economic development express train, and to show China is coming to the central stage of the world. That's what the official view. And some of the American scholars, to a certain extent, they agree with that. They have criticized American leadership, America not being part of this, because some European countries and other countries, now it's more than 160 partners, including international organizations, being part of that, covers 2/3 of the world. The second view is most Western scholars talking about the Belt and Road Initiative as a Chinese effort to build a network of non-Western countries against the US and Western powers. It's kind of, from my perspective, is Danny talked about the Cold War instrument for China to build its predominance or primacy in what Chinese call greater periphery. China used to talk of periphery only those are geographically close countries. Now they expanded all the way to Africa and other parts of the world. Non-democratic authoritarian governments to resist liberal world. In the future, even people wrote that those countries will all speak Chinese. That's to my advantage. And they will all watch the Chinese CCTV, Central Television Station. They will all go to Chinese universities and all those kind of things. So it's something the America and the Western countries should fight back. So third view, which I agree, is that it is one belt, one road, and one trap. There are so many traps in this process. Chinese promised $1 trillion, and which far is enough. And there are so many economic, political, diplomatic value traps that China have to overcome, which China has not, before they could build an alliance or a network. In fact, look at those agreements. They now have over 100 agreements. I just read them all. Look at them. They are all bilateral. All bilateral. It's not multilateral. AIB is a more kind of a multilateral and follow the Western practices and development, institutional practice. So this one belt, one road is total Chinese. Even the arbitration is in Chinese court. It's very different from those international development institutions. And many people criticize China for the debt trap diplomacy. Yes, China's, as African scholar talk about, those countries got China's so-called assistance. These are not well done feasibility studies. A lot of them end up elephant projects cannot get a return. Although China could use them as debt into equity, try to get assets. But not every country has those assets China could get. Very often, China itself is a victim. And China does not have accept universal values for those countries to inspire. And China's corruption, the corruption is a big issue in China, but also in those countries. Those dictators, why they like money from China? Because it is non-transparent. It's not built in the open market. So for those corrupt officials, China is corrupt. There are not corruptions in China, but there are more corruptions in those Belt and Road countries, those developing countries. So this type of practice is a trap. There are so many traps for China to overcome. So that's why I think China has learned their lessons. 2018 began 2018. China has somehow, pulled back. And they try to get international institutions like World Bank, some other international institutions to be part of that. And also Western multilateral corporations to be part of that. But they have not got in because not transparent, those type of environmental, all those issues, not to the Western standard. So China now said, we'll try to pay attention to the debt issue. We'll try to get international multinational corporation to involved. And this year, the pandemic, we see a huge problem for China. In the G20, they talk about the debt relief. And a lot of this debt from China. China has overtaken all the Western countries as the largest creditor to the world. And a lot of those debts are in trouble. So China now have to, emphasize more in now the China called dual circulation, domestic market and international market, dual markets. But they emphasize more on the domestic market, which is a very good indication that the One Belt One Road is in trouble.
Thank you very much. I had another question here, moving to Latin America. Mariano mentioned that there could be actions that would help solve the terrible situation in Venezuela. And the questioner wants to know if you could expand on that. And with respect to Central America, is there a good way to support the economies in Honduras and Guatemala, so on and so forth?
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very brief because I think that we are very close to, at least in the country where I am, is midnight. So regarding Venezuela, I think that the first step, as I mentioned before, is to end any kind of military intervention threat. Although I have been thinking for the last years that the US or the Trump administration hadn't any intention really of intervening militarily in Venezuela. The threat was there. So it's important that it will disappear also in order that will not be used by Maduro, and in order that will, I would say, create a kind of, let's call it, peaceful environment or civilized environment without the threat of a military intervention. The second point is that the US will cooperate in a multilateral diplomacy with Europe and with Latin American countries. Because so far, a very hawkish person, Elliot Abrams, he has been the special envoy for Venezuela, which is to, as the joke says, is like to hire Al Capone to be the guard of a bank. And Elliot Abrams has been the special envoy, which is also, by the way, a special envoy also for Iran. And he has been most of the time, putting obstacles to the diplomacy of the European Union and some of the countries in Latin America, because some others, as Colombia, for example, they have been cooperating strongly with the very hawkish US position. So multilateral diplomacy is important. A third point, which is, I would say, sensitive, it's not easy, but is opening, cooperating, or leaving or using allies, countries as Norway and some others, to open spaces of dialogue with Russia and China about Venezuela. So could be very discreet channels in whatever way is possible. Could be through third parties, but in a way that the US could have conversations with China and Russia about how to solve the political crisis in Venezuela. Another very important issue is to lift the sanctions that are affecting the population and not the regime. So there are other series of measures that recently the Washington office in Latin America, WOLA, published a very interesting memo that is in their website, and these are some of them. Regarding Central America, it's important to say that the Biden plan of the four, this huge plan of investments in Latin America is important, probably will be helpful, but at the same time, it's important to remember that there are many studies about different countries and regions of the world in which I would say modernization and economic growth not necessarily stop migration, because the people migrate when the countries are in collapse, but the people migrate also when the countries are in a better position, but they want to have a better life. So it's very likely that the push of migrants towards the United States will continue. Hopefully they will, if they at some point understand also that the crisis, that if I am right about the crisis that I described before, that perhaps will be not so interesting to emigrate to the United States. But again, if we compare the terrible situations in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, it's very likely that the people will continue to do it. It's very, I would say that it's perhaps better to assume a position, and I'm here linking what Zachariah said before about sub-Saharan, particularly Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps the best that the US could do in the near future and in the midterm is implementing this plan, sending the money, helping about the, relieving the debt of these countries in Central America, and then stopping all the different measures that are violating human rights against immigrants, looking for the kids that are separated from their parents inside the United States, and then having some kinds of hands off. Perhaps it's better not to be so worried about Central America and taking the time to see what the United States can do towards this region.
Because we are conscious of the fact that we are coming up on you now entering your second day in this particular meeting, we do have to wrap up shortly. But I did want to open the floor to both Sarah and to Zachariah for any final thoughts that you might have on near-term actions or first 100-day sort of steps that you would like to see the Biden administration take in your areas of interest.
Should I
go ahead, Sarah.
We have made, my organization has made a number of recommendations to the Biden administration, several of which I think will, on the face of it, should be easy and eminently doable by President-elect, soon to be President Biden, but there will be an important test about how seriously we should take President-elect Biden's promises to change the relationship with Saudi Arabia. For example, one of the first things that Biden can do on January 20 with the stroke of a pen is to release the Department of Intelligence's report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and specifically the evidence and information they gathered that led the CIA to conclude that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, was liable for the murder. This is something that the Congress demanded that the State Department release in a rule, and the Trump administration at first defied Congress and refused to release it, and then ultimately did release it, but classified, except that the demand was that it be public. And so now there is a lawsuit against the DIE and the Director of Intelligence, brought by the Open Society Justice Initiative. We have submitted an amicus brief demanding that they release this report, that there is no justification for them to keep this report confidential. Since Biden has promised accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, since he has said that he will seek to hold Mohammed bin Salman accountable for this murder, very simple, all he can do is release the report. And don't force us to sue the government to force you to do it. Release the report that Congress has asked that you make public. Will he do this? Another big test we'll see, unless the Trump administration acts in the next 2 days to do this, is whether or not he will move to grant Mohammed bin Salman immunity from prosecution. The Saudi Crown Prince faces 3 lawsuits in the US right now, including by my organization, for the murder of our founder, Jamal Khashoggi. Mohammed bin Salman has asked the State Department for immunity, which the Trump administration has 2 more days left to do, and I don't think they can actually push it through over the next 2 days. I'm sure that he will keep that request alive with the Biden administration. Will the Biden administration grant him immunity? So that will be another big test. Of course, there are much bigger asks, you know, join the ICC, end sanctions on Iran, de-designate the Houthis. Those are bigger issues and they'll take longer time. But this is a small test, a small ask, something they can easily do. And if they fail to do them, it will be very telling and very damning indeed.
Thank you. Zachariah?
Yeah, I know we have, we're over time, so I'm just gonna say 2 sort of general things rather than trying to cover all of Africa and all the things that the Biden administration could do. First, a very general point, as we're seeing in Uganda currently, which just had its election yesterday. You know, we have long supported the authoritarian regime of Yoweri Museveni, as we do many other authoritarian governments across Africa. And the U.S. ambassador actually tried to visit the head of the opposition party's house yesterday. He's under house arrest. The Ugandan military has surrounded him. And despite the fact that the US has given over $1 billion to the Ugandan government in just the past year, the US ambassador was turned away from visiting the head of the opposition in Uganda yesterday. And so I hope at some point we start to realize that our support for these authoritarian regimes makes us quite a hated government in these countries, and that even that money doesn't even buy us access to political figures in countries like Uganda. So it's not even clear what we're getting spending so much money to support these authoritarian figures. Similarly, I think since the Obama administration, there has been a conflation of US humanitarian and development policy with national security policy. Sadly, I think that's going to continue with the Biden administration. As we heard, I think just yesterday, the head of the United States Agency for International Development, Samantha Powers, is going to be elevated to a position on the National Security Council. This is something that started under the Obama administration when the USAID administrator at the time, Raj Patel, made a very clear announcement that he was going to pivot from USAID being independent of the national security apparatus to aligning USAID projects directly with national security. This should be hugely offensive to all Americans. It's really destructive for our image abroad. Just think about what it means that every time we engage in the humanitarian or developmental policy in a foreign country, we have to first assess whether it is in our security interests to do so. That is very, very short-sighted. It is very distressing that the Biden administration is planning on continuing this and perhaps even extending it by turning our top humanitarian official into a member of our security apparatus. I hope that we, as a concerned public, can push back against this tendency, and I will leave it at that because I think it's probably the most important point I want to communicate today.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Thank you for your questions and for your interest. Danny, do you have any closing thoughts for us this evening?
I just want to echo the gratitude that you've expressed, Lorena, to our audience members for zooming in for this rich discussion. I want to thank our panelists and all of them, of course, but especially Mariano, who is now past his bedtime. Thank you for agreeing, Mariano, to participate in this discussion into, I guess it's now Tuesday for you. No, but it was really a fabulously thought-provoking conversation as we enter this new era, the Biden era. I think this was a very, there was just tremendous food for thought from all 4 of our speakers, Zachariah, Mariano, Sarah, and Sam. I have included the Twitter handles of the 3 speakers who are on Twitter. For those of you who want to follow them on that particular platform. And for those of you who want to follow the organizations with which some of them are associated, feel free to email me if you'd like to follow up with any thoughts, comments, or questions or suggestions. It's danny.postel@northwestern.edu, danny.postel@northwestern.edu. Remember that this is a monthly series between Northwestern Center for International and Area Studies and the Evanston Public Library. We will soon be advertising our events in February and March. Stay tuned for those. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this fabulously rich and thought-provoking conversation, and particularly to our panelists.
Yes, thank you very much.